So in this video, I'm going to walk you through my process of color correction in Adobe Lightroom for GoPro Protune Flat images. And those are images that are shot in Protune using a flat color in the GoPro. So I'm not going to be talking about all the features of Lightroom. I think it's a pretty great program. I've started using it more than Photoshop or any other type of photo editing program because I find that it's really easy to store my photos, it's really easy to develop my photos, and it has this nice collections box here that keeps all of your photos in certain folders, which I really like. So today I'm going to be color correcting this image, which I took at the Saran St. Vrain trailhead. Okay, so once you import the photo or photos that you want to correct, you go to Develop, and if you hover at the top here, the bar right here will show up. So click on Develop, and that will take my photo out of the library and into the Develop tab. And the first thing that I do is I adjust the white balance. Sometimes I find that my GoPro leaves the images a little bit warm, especially if I'm shooting outside. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the temperature control here, and I'm going to drag it into the blue, and see if I go way into the blue, you can really see it washes my image out in blue. Conversely, if I go way over into the yellows, it's going to warm up my image and give it an ugly yellow tone. So what I'm going to do is, because I know that it's a little warm for my taste, I'm going to go to the extreme in blue, and what I like to do is just slightly come back until it looks about right for me. In this case, I'm going to leave it at about -13. And then I go down to Tint, and this is going to be between green and a purple magenta. And because I know that my image is already started out warm, I'm going to drag it over into green. And that's a little bit too much. Maybe if I come down just a tad, -4. Notice that it's easier to see the greens and the trees. So next I go down to my exposure. In this case, I feel like my exposure was set pretty well for the shot, so I'm going to leave it alone. I usually don't touch contrast, and I'll tell you why. It's because instead of setting the contrast up here, which can crush your blacks or fade the detail out of your image, I'm going to show you how to work with the whites, blacks, shadows, and highlights. So the first thing I do is I set my whites, and I hold down Option, and then I drag the slider. And notice you can see white in the top of my image there, and that's where the light's coming through the trees. In that case, if I drag my whites all the way down, it's still not going to change much. And I'm going to have to live with the fact that some of my image is blown out. But if I drag it to the opposite end of the spectrum, notice that dots start appearing around my image, and those are the locations where it's going to bleach out your image. Yeah, that's just way too bright for me. So I'm going to go ahead and drag it down. In this case, if I go all the way, it doesn't really matter because I still have white in my image. But if I didn't, I would drag it to the point right before white blotches started showing. Next, I'm going to work with my blacks, and notice my image is completely white right now if I hold down Option and start moving the slider. If I move my slider to the left, it's going to make my image darker in the places that it's already dark or black. And notice that if I keep dragging it, you can start to see black bleed through the white there. And those are the areas that the blacks are getting crushed. And what I mean by that is that it's losing detail in those areas. But that's okay if those areas are already dark or black to begin with. In this case, I'm going to drag it just above the point where the black starts fading through. Next, I'm going to go up to my shadows here. And if I hold down Option, I can drag left just like I did my blacks and start seeing where the blacks start fading through. So in this case, I'm going to drag my shadows down just as the black starts fading through. And next I usually bring down my highlights. If I bring them down all the way, notice that the light coming through the trees isn't nearly as washed out and bright as it was before. And for this shot, I'm actually going to not quite drag the highlights down all the way. Now if I had the highlights on the other point in my image, notice how bright and washed out my trees are. So I'm going to leave it just about there. And what this is doing is this is setting the contrast of your image without worrying about crushing or blowing out the highlights and the shadows in your photo. So next there's clarity, and clarity is a really cool feature. It really makes the details in your image stand out. Notice if I drag it all the way to the right, it really makes those rocks look edgy and easy to see. And if I drag it down all the way to the left, it makes my image really blurry. I almost always drag the clarity up. And because I always set the sharpness low in my Protune settings on my GoPro, I can really bring the clarity up as much as I want without it looking too fake or funky. Okay, so now there's vibrance and there's saturation. And I'm going to tell you why I never really use saturation and instead I use vibrance. So in order to show you the difference between vibrance and saturation, I'm actually going to have to pull up another photo that has skin tones in it. Okay, so this image has already been edited and the vibrance is set at 100%. But I'm going to bring that down to 0. And instead, I'm going to raise the saturation. So notice if I raise the saturation to 100%, my skin tones start getting a little oversaturated. And this effect is even more noticeable if you shoot in warm lighting and you have a lot of people. So in this case, I'm going to bring the vibrance to 100% and notice that my trees and a few of my rocks look oversaturated. So I'm going to bring it down just a tad to about there. Now I'm going to go down to my hue, saturation, and luminance controls. So I'm going to run through this really quick for you. Hue adjusts the tone of your color for red, orange, yellow, green, aqua, blue, purple, and magenta. So notice if I start dragging the colors on orange, yellow, green, and maybe a little bit of aqua, it changes the tones of my image. But if I mess with the magenta, the red, and the purple, it doesn't really do anything. And that's because my image is mainly made up of orange, yellow, and green tones. Depending on what is in your photo, you'll have to set the hue accordingly. And in most cases, I don't mess with the hues a whole lot. In this case, I'll make the yellows just a tad darker and make the greens just a tad more yellow. Next is saturation. This works the same as setting the hues, except instead of changing the tone, it changes the saturation of your colors. It's pretty self-explanatory, and once again, the orange, yellows, and greens are going to be the colors most affected if I change the saturation in this image. So I'm going to bring out the orange tones in the rocks just a little bit. Notice if I drag it to 100%, it might look good, but that's not really how the rocks looked in real life. They looked about like that. Next, I'm going to bring out the yellow tones in the rocks and the trees to about there. And I think the trees in the background look a little bit washed out, so I'm going to bring the greens up to about 50. I'm going to leave everything else alone. Next is luminance. If hue is adjusting the tones, saturation is bringing out the colors, luminance is changing the lighting on each individual color. So once again, I have orange, yellow, and green as my main colors in this image. Notice the rocks in the front. If I bring the yellow all the way down, it reduces the amount of light hitting the rocks. If I bring it all the way up, it looks like my rocks are a lot more highlighted than they were in real life. So I'm going to leave yellow alone. Same goes for my trees. If I bring it down all the way to the left, it's going to reduce the highlights in my trees. And if I go all the way over, it's going to make it look a little too bright. So I'm just going to bring my greens up just a little bit. Notice that there's also a black and white option. I'm not going to be covering black and white editing in this tutorial, maybe later on, but I usually don't do a whole lot of work in black and white. Notice if I click on it, it will turn my image into a black and white photo. Okay, so next I go down to detail. And here is where I'm going to sharpen my image up a little bit because I already increased the detail and the clarity, but now I'm going to sharpen it up just a little bit more. So I'm going to bring it up to about 40. And I wouldn't usually be doing this, but because I shot in GoPro Protune and I lowered my sharpness manually on my camera, I always have to add a layer of sharpening in post-production. And finally, what I'm going to be showing you is split toning. So we have the highlights and the shadows, and we can adjust the hue for each and the saturation of that hue. So split toning can give your image a dramatic effect and can change the mood of your photograph. So I'm going to go to my highlights, and I'm going to increase the saturation to show you how I work with this. Let's say I wanted a blue, cool feel to this image. Well, what I would do is I would set a blue or an aqua hue, and I would bring my saturation all the way up because I like to come in from there and stop where I think it gives the image a nice hue. So I'm going to leave it about there. So now I'm going to adjust the same for my shadows. In this case, I want my shadows to be warm, and it's already set down in the reds and the yellows. So I'm going to drag it up just a little bit orange, and I'm going to pull up the saturation to 100%. I'll come down from there. And now it gives my shadows a nice warm touch. Finally, I'm going to balance the highlights and the shadows. If I slide all the way to the left, it's only going to show me my shadows. If I go all the way to the right, it's only going to show me what I've corrected in my highlights. In this case, I want my image to be a little bit more blue, but I still want the warmth in the shadows. So I'm going to bring it just a little into the highlights section, and I'm going to leave it about there. And that's how I color correct an image in Adobe Lightroom.